As you watch this wonderful family history video, think of your lives and how they have been shaped by the lives of your great-grandparents, grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, and great-aunts and uncles. All of us inherited the resilience and fortitude that it takes to face difficult and at times overwhelming situations. We learn that we have to work hard for what we want. We learn to have goals and not to be stymied when we don't reach them or be discouraged when things don't turn out the way we want them to initially. We learn that there will always be hurdles to face, but we must move forward. Nani and Papu set the example for us, and that's why each of you have achieved success in your lives and will continue to pursue your dreams. I love you all very much. To Karen from your Auntie Dee, to Michael, Sophia, and Bella from Aunt Dora, to Diane and Debbie from Auntie Dora. This is an American story, but it doesn't begin in America. It begins here, in Pyrgos, Greece, in the late 1800s. Pyrgos, which literally means tower, is a village on the Aegean island of Santorini, in the northwestern Peloponnesus, Greece, capital of the regional unit of Ilias. The population of the town in 1900 was 12,700. Pyrgos is 10 miles west of Olympia, 43 miles southwest of Patras, and about 53 miles west of Tripoli. This is where Pelopidas Mantzoukas was born and where he grew up. He lived here with his parents and siblings. They were hard workers and set great store in community and tradition. An illustrious and somewhat prophetic namesake, Pelopidas was named for the great general and statesman from Thebes, who died in 364 BC in Thessaly. He was a member of a distinguished family and possessed great wealth, which he expended on friends and public service, while he himself was content to lead a rough and simple life. Even though he had a wife and children, he honored his obligations to his countrymen. He was a trendsetter and trailblazer in his time, and his namesake followed in his ancient footsteps. For in 1910, Pelopidas Mantzoukas set out to make his mark in America. He traveled on the ship SS Laura, which departed from Trieste, Italy, and arrived in New York Harbor on November 10, 1910. Most of his family would eventually follow him and take his new name in America. Between 1880 and 1924, nearly 25 million immigrants left their homelands for dreams of a better life in America. Of the 12 million who entered America, tens of thousands were detained at Ellis Island hospitals for possible infectious disease or other debilitating health concerns. In a time before antibiotics, contagions like cholera, diphtheria, typhus, tuberculosis, polio, and trichinosis could spread throughout communities with fatal consequence, which made Ellis Island a key barrier to the spread of infectious disease into American cities. Wealthy first-class passengers were hardly given a fleeting glance before clearance, but for those arriving in steerage class, a thorough medical examination stood between their freedom and America. They were then herded past a dozen or so doctors working the line, as it was known, who had 30 seconds to determine whether the immigrant in front of them merited a more comprehensive medical exam. 1 in 5 immigrants received a chalk mark indicating a suspected condition, which would subsequently open them up to further testing and diagnosis in one of the 3 main hospitals on the island. In use from 1892 to 1924, Ellis Island is now part of the Statue of Liberty National Monument. More than 350 babies were born on the island. Many of the newborns were named for the doctors and nurses who helped them into the world. Conversely, more than 3,500 arriving immigrants died on the island, making the 27-acre landmark a key focal point in the story of America. Ellis Island has millions of stories that whisper through its halls of the past, now present. This is one of those stories. On November 10, 1910, Pelopidas Montsouris arrived at Ellis Island in search of a better life in America. This is his story. According to recorded immigration records, the largest wave of Greek immigration to the U.S. occurred between 1900 and 1924. However, in my research, I have found that a large number of Greeks immigrated to the U.S. between 1830 and 1840, after the Greek Revolution, and were pioneers in textile industries, which became the main economic driver in New England. Reportedly, with a history in shipbuilding, captains and sailors also arrived and helped in the training of the U.S. Navy. While the largest number of Greek citizens settled on the eastern seaboard, many migrated across the U.S. as far as California. In 1900, Greeks comprised 0.4% of the U.S. population. Today, more than 100 years later, that number is only 0.6%. Pelopidas arrived in New York Harbor on the SS Laura. The ship was built in 1875 and was owned by Maersk Company. It was the first to bear the white 7-pointed star emblem of the Maersk shipping line. After exhaustive research, this is the only image I could find. The SS Laura departed from Trieste to the United States on October 23, 1910. On November 10, 1910, she arrived in New York Harbor. The shipping manifest shows that Pelopidas made that journey. He names his mother Eugenia as next of kin. He also states that he is a laborer and names his intended final destination as Boston, Massachusetts. His brother Athanasios Montsouris sailed later from Patras, Greece, leaving on the ship SS Laconia, sailing from Patras to the United States on March 17, 1914, and arriving at Ellis Island on April 2, 1914. Both brothers enduring a journey of more than 2 weeks aboard ship. This is New York in 1911. This is most likely what he saw. What must he have thought? A young man of 19 in a new country with his whole life ahead of him. It must have been exhilarating and a bit scary. The skyscrapers, ordinary men and women in fancy dress, the busy streets with people moving to and fro. Everyone seemed to be in a hurry. Here there seemed to be no sense of community like in Pyrgos. In fact, it doesn't appear that anyone knows anyone here. The noisy tenements, the crowded streets, the exotic nightlife, the bright lights, it must have been mesmerizing to a young man of 19. But he was raised well, and with all the things that must have gone through his mind, finding work was most likely at the top of that list. So he set out to find work doing anything he could. With a gallant demeanor and a welcoming smile, he found that he had an affinity for the restaurant business. He worked as busboy, kitchen hand, and anything else he could do. He gradually worked his way up to waiter and then manager. Many years later, he would work for the Boston Showcase Company, which was founded in 1913 by Max Starr, an immigrant from Russia who started the company in Roxbury, Massachusetts. The company crafted fine millwork, including showcases and cabinetry for department stores, bars, and restaurants. After arriving in New York, Pelopidas quickly established himself in the city of his destination, Boston, Massachusetts. As the years rolled by, he worked hard and saved his money. He had risen from busboy and dishwasher to waiter and was becoming quite successful in the hospitality industry. In October of 1916, he petitioned for naturalization as an American citizen. On February 12, 1917, Pelopidas Matsoukaras became a naturalized U.S. citizen. At the time, he was living at 152 Massachusetts Avenue, Boston, Massachusetts, and worked for Adams House Hotel and Restaurant as a waiter. A very upscale hotel with an impressive clientele of big business clients and politicians. Among its residents, Adams House boasted such names as world leaders, governors, and even future presidents. Calvin Coolidge was a longtime guest of the hotel and had his own suite on one of the top floors. It is more than likely that it was here that Pelopidas met Spiros C. Demeter, a fellow Greek restaurateur. It shows on his naturalization document that Spiros Demeter, restaurateur, gives an affidavit as witness to the character of this as a candidate for citizenship. Around July of 1917, Pelopidas Matsoukaras enlisted with the War Department to serve in World War I as an American. On his registration card, he indicates that he lives at 89 Belvedere Street in Boston, Massachusetts, that his mother is in Greece, that he is single, and he also indicates that he is employed by Adams House Restaurant in Boston as a waiter. On August 13th, he received notice of certification to report to Boston's District Board No. 7. On October 5th, 1917, he received his marching orders. Pelopidas had wanted to return to Greece and fight in the Balkan War, but was unable. Now he was going to war as an American to fight for his new country. On April 2, 1917, after standing on the sidelines for as long as he could, President Woodrow Wilson went before a joint session of Congress to request a declaration of war against Germany to assist French and British allies. Germany's continued submarine attacks on passenger and merchant ships in 1917 became the primary motivation behind Wilson's decision. America was going to war. Germany signed an armistice agreement with the Allies, and on November 11, 1918, World War I, known as the War to End All Wars because of the great slaughter and destruction it caused, was over. On November 15, 1919, Pelopidas received honorable discharge from the United States Army. Pelopidas Montsecuris was honorably discharged from military duty with corporal status. On April 17, 1920, Pelopidas Montsecuris officially changed his name to Peter Manty. An exciting new decade awaited him. After the war, Americans were tired of fighting. They were tired of trying to make the world safe for democracy. It was the Jazz Age, the Roaring Twenties, the decade in which the hard work ethics of the previous decade were set aside. This was the decade of spending, leisure, and above all, fun. The focus changed from oil and steel production, and industry boomed with the focus on the everyday consumer. Electrical products came into every household. The radio was a major gathering place among families for soaps and theater entertainment. Henry Ford started the assembly line concept and began producing more automobiles than ever before. Soon everyone owned one. Banks gave credit to everyone, and within no time, everyone was living beyond their means. Transportation led to urbanization and the rise of the suburbs. People could work in the towns and live in the country. Millions bought homes on credit and moved away from the city. The country was shaking off the dust of old tried and true conventions and creating new ones. Perhaps the most liberated of this era were the women. They tossed out their corsets and shortened their skirts, bobbed their hair, and drank bathtub gin. They began smoking in public and dancing all night in clubs and speakeasies. Before Prohibition, the alcohol flowed and the bands played on. During this time, Peter Manty had been working and saving his funds. He had big dreams. In 1919, after returning home from the war, he left the hustle and bustle of Boston for a slightly quieter and more stable New England town. He moved to Bangor, Maine. He bought a home for $12,000 at 119 Sanford Street and began putting his dreams into action. On February 23, 1923, Peter opened University Lunch Restaurant. This was a $30,000 investment at the time. He began advertising in local papers as well as the university campus papers, even in their yearbooks. He received a write-up in the local paper announcing the opening of his new restaurant as a cut above the rest for Bangor eateries. This is pure speculation on my part, but perhaps Peter got the idea for University Lunch from his days working at the Adams House Hotel and Restaurant in Boston. Adams House was near the Harvard campus, and in addition to the upscale clientele, they primarily served the population of Harvard students and staff. His idea for University Lunch is very similar: an upscale restaurant with impeccable interior, food, and service at an affordable price, positioned within 5 to 15 minutes proximity to the University of Maine in Orono, depending on your mode of transportation, that is. Peter's daily commute from home to his restaurant was roughly 10 minutes, driving. But like his ancient predecessor, the great Pelopidas of Thessaly, Peter Manty was a man of purpose, and his work had just begun. In that same year, on November 11th, 1923, the organization was formed to petition for a parish charter in Bangor. The petition was sent to the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of North and South America. Peter Manty was one of the parish presidents and a key member of the organization to build the St. George Greek Orthodox Church in Bangor, Maine. The excitement around those early months of planning was in later years recounted by Peter Manty as indescribable. He and 2 other members began raising funds to build the new church. The location for the church would be 90 Sanford Street, Bangor, Maine. That was literally 1 block from his house at 119 Sanford. The committee selected to oversee the building included Peter Manty as chairman. Many years later, after Peter's death, Aspasia Manty received an invitation to the 50th anniversary of the church and a most touching letter from Father Andrew George, expressing how truly instrumental Peter Manty was in the origins of the church, and that if not for him, the church would not be there today. He also asks her if she could write a little something that he could read at the anniversary celebration dinner in Peter's honor. Knowing Aspasia, I am most certain that she complied. Aspasia Mikos arrived in the U.S. with her parents John and Helen Mikos by way of Ellis Island around 1912. She was very young at the time, no more than 2 years old. At this time, I have not been able to find the actual ship manifest for their arrival. Much like Pelopidas, Aspasia was also named after a Greek woman in classical era Athens, who, according to Plutarch, attracted the most prominent writers and thinkers of the time, including the philosopher Socrates. Her home became an intellectual center in Athens. Socrates describes her as a skilled teacher of rhetoric. She was the companion of the statesman Pericles, with whom she had a son, Pericles the Younger. But the full details of the couple's marital status are unknown. Aspasia is mentioned in the writings of Plato, Aristophanes, and others. In modern times, she may be known as a witty and competent hostess with the mostess, someone who holds court upon entering a room while flawlessly attired without an eyelash out of place. That person who can talk to anyone on any subject, has an infectious manner with a humble grace, skilled in social rhetoric, and knowledgeable on a variety of subject matters. Someone with an endearingly pleasant demeanor who never met a stranger. Add to this a kind-hearted soul, and above all, a passionate mistress of the theater and all things artistic, and you have Aspasia Mikos Manty. She was an avid reader, and her aspirations for the theater came at a very early age. She had wanted to go on stage as an actress, and probably spent hours poring over stage and screen mags of the day. But she was young and beautiful and was nearing the marrying age. Though born in Cairo while her parents were working in Egypt, she was Greek by ethnicity, and in Greek culture and tradition, arranged marriages are common. It was not a situation of forcing one to marry. However, it was understood that parents would assist in finding an appropriate mate for their daughters. Her dreams of a career would have to wait. For the early part of the 1920s, Aspasia was living with her parents and siblings at 19 Riverside Street in Danvers, Massachusetts. It is not quite certain how or when they met, but most likely it would have been through the church or other traditional Greek events or gatherings. During this time, Peter Manty was a successful business proprietor who owned his own home and was working on the formation of the first Greek Orthodox church in Bangor. Pretty impressive. It is most likely that Peter spoke with Aspasia's parents regarding the arrangements and was given consent and full blessings by her parents to court and marry. In any case, they were married in 1927. Aspasia was 18 and Peter was 34. Though Peter lived in Bangor, Maine, they were married in Boston. This may be because that's where most of Peter's family was located. They honeymooned at Le Chateau Frontenac in Quebec, Canada. Le Chateau Frontenac is one of UNESCO's World Heritage Sites and is named after the flamboyant French governor Louis Dubald, Count of Frontenac. The honeymoon was over, and the Mantys returned to Maine and settled into making a life for themselves. For Aspasia, this must have been a new and exciting adventure. But if anyone was equipped to handle the social duties that went along with being the wife of a successful businessman and community leader, she was. She quickly assimilated to her new surroundings and set about making the house a home. Over the years, Aspasia became active in social and civic events. She gave several talks on Greek culture and arranged marriage, among other topics. She talked of the Greek courting and mating culture and how it was not so different from the way it's done in America. Her talks were always lively, entertaining, and knowledgeable, with an air of elegance and flair that would have made her namesake proud. The newspapers of the day called her presentations a delightful experience that should be seen. Not to be left out, usually these events would end with Peter singing a traditional Greek song as Aspasia looked on admiringly. Peter's social obligations were much the same. In addition, Peter was a proud member of the American Legion, Post 12, in Bangor, and engaged in many of their philanthropic activities. He did a lot of catering for these functions as well as others through university lunch, and often he and Aspasia would provide the entertainment as well. Often Aspasia would give a talk on Greek culture, or one or both would sing, usually a Greek folk song. Always these events were closed with delicious Greek hors d'oeuvres provided by none other than university lunch. The newspaper reviews in the social register were always glowing. Together, they were quite the social duo in Maine. In 1927, a fire breaks out in Bangor at the Co Building on Main Street. It spreads to the adjacent blocks of Cross and Columbia Streets in one of the largest fires that Bangor had seen since the Great Fire of 1911. The size and wrath of the fire made news around the country. The YWCA building was burned to the ground, sending women running to the street to escape the blaze. When the roof of the City Hall caught fire, the mayor, John Wilson, called out state militia to remove the city's funds and documents to a separate location and to stand guard over them along with the building of merchants who had been removed from their businesses due to the fire. In the end, the fire caused more than $1 million in damages. Governor Ralph O. Brewster calls out an all-state emergency. Remember this name. He shows up a little bit later. This is the Co Building today. This is the building that was refurbished that caught on fire. This is at the corner of Cross and Main Street where the fire broke out. The alleyway is Cross and the adjacent street is Columbia. The church at the end of Cross that you see here was spared, but the buildings across from it, next to it, was where the YWCA was that burned to the ground. This is Peter's restaurant, which was about 1.5 blocks from the disaster. Peter Mantys' university lunch steps up to serve the Bangor Fire Department and the visiting firemen as they attempt to fight the blazes in what turns out to be an arduous and long undertaking. A few weeks later, Peter received a letter from the mayor of Bangor expressing his surprise and gratitude at Peter's selfless, civic-minded efforts of that day. In the letter he writes, quote, "It was such a splendid example of civic spirit that I took the liberty of mentioning it to the press, as I feel that it would do a lot of good to have it generally known." End quote. Mayor Wilson was as good as his word, and he submitted this to the press. I'll read it. Mantys' generosity. Peter Manty, proprietor of University Lunch in State Street, presented Mayor Wilson on Tuesday with a receipt bill for $42 for the lunches and cigars served to the visiting firemen who did such valiant work in the Great Fire of Sunday night. The firemen were given everything which the University Lunch possessed, and cigars were handed out liberally. The visitors were loud in their praise of what was done for them here. Mr. Manty stated that he did not wish the city or firemen to pay for food or cigars under such trying conditions, etc., etc. Peter and Aspasia take time for some fun in the sun. The parish council, of which Peter Manty is chairman, sponsored Greek cultural events to raise funds for the church. Several of these were Greek theater productions. Guess who played the lead? They raised thousands of dollars for the church and entertained the social set of Bangor in grand style. Peter's brother Charlie came to visit along with his wife Amelia. They also took part in some of the productions. Aspasia was in grand form and starred as leading lady in 2 of the plays. After the production, a banquet of Greek delicacies were served to the attendees. The productions became so well received in the community that they had to keep finding larger and larger venues to accommodate an ever-growing audience. Most of the attendees were of non-Greek origin. These productions became the highlight of the Bangor social season. Afterwards, a large ball was attended by the cast and local community. The gala became a prestigious affair of who's who in Bangor. By 1930, St. George Greek Orthodox Church of Bangor, Maine, is finished. At an opening ceremony, Peter Manty is celebrated and awarded a plaque as a token of appreciation for his exhaustive efforts in spearheading the project. As 1930 rolls in, the U.S. Census shows that Peter and Aspasia are the only ones living at the house on Sanford Street in Bangor, Maine. However, that's about to change. In 1930, Eugenia Manty was born. The Mantys are now a family. Thalia and Alexandra would soon follow. During the early part of the 1930s, great times were had at the house on Sanford Street. Family and friends came up from Boston to visit often. Peter's brothers Charlie and Theodore visited often, as evidenced through hunting and fishing licenses issued through the Bangor County Clerk. Aspasia was proving to be a warm and loving mother, as well as a supportive wife, and even managed to carve out time for her passion, the theater. Aspasia performs in Ibsen's play A Doll's House and receives rave reviews. Baby Alexandra also makes her stage debut in the play, and audiences are thrilled. The write-up in the Bangor Daily News is right next to another article about King George and Queen Victoria. Fancy that. They both maintain their civic and social obligations with style and their usual flair. But with a growing family, Peter is now working harder than ever. University Lunch is a success. In addition, he had leased the other stores in the building for a grand sum of $7,500 per month, with the intention of subletting them to other business concerns. A prestigious law firm and a beauty salon had already signed leases with Peter Manty for occupancy in the building. It must have been wonderful to see his dreams and ambitions realized. He had come a long way from being a waiter at Adams' house in Boston. In fact, things were going so well that earlier in 1925, he and a partner opened a second restaurant in Boston called the Traymore. His formula is the same. The Traymore is near Cambridge University and elaborately built to serve an upscale clientele as well as the university students and staff. By now, the restaurant construction was completed and notes were coming due, along with his monthly leases for the stores at the State Street building, which was not fully sublet. The fast and carefree pace of the Roaring Twenties had long subsided to a low purr. The Great Depression of the 30s would last for more than a decade. Many would be irreparably devastated before it was over. The market crash of October 1929 was the culmination of a perfect storm. It swept through the country like a tidal wave, leaving chaos and poverty where there had been gaiety and opulence. The country was on tilt. By the end of the 30s, a cold wind was blowing, and no one felt it more than Peter Manty. The stark realization that the illusion of prosperity that so captivated people for nearly a decade was indeed an illusion fell like a ton of bricks. A kind of mass hysteria took hold as thousands of people stood endlessly outside the New York Stock Exchange for days. Panic was real, and a sense of doom was thick in the air. To the layman, I dare say even the experts, this was incomprehensible, but everyone knew what it meant: ruin. In 1935, Peter writes a letter to his congressman, Ralph O. Brewster, 3rd District, Maine, requesting a loan to save his business. Remember this guy? Back in 1927, he was governor of Maine, and along with Mayor John Wilson, praised Peter for his assistance with the Co-Building fire. Brewster's response to Peter's request was negative. He explained that the Depression ruined many businesses, and that Maine would soon offer public works programs that with Peter's veteran status he should apply for, instead of going deeper in debt by taking out more loans. Peter was devastated as he watched his dreams dissolving before his eyes. There are no words for the futility he must have felt. When all was said and done, Peter Manty had lost everything. But he was not out for the count. His strong convictions and his solid work ethic kicked in. He had a wife and 3 children to support, and that's exactly what he did. He salvaged what he could. He sold his home on Sanford Street to his close friends Mr. and Mrs. Pradaris. Their son Angelo had just married Georgia, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. John L. Scofius. The Pradarises, John Scofius and he, had been friends since the planting days of St. George Church, so many years ago. They had been on the board together. After the sale of the house, Peter collected what savings he had and moved his family to Brookline, Massachusetts, to start again. Around 1938, Peter and his family returned to Massachusetts. They must have felt some disappointment, but it was not the way of the Mantys to sit around and mope feeling sorry. They got right back to work in Massachusetts and began again. The hardships of the Depression-era 30s were just beginning to subside, and as the 1940s rolled in, the Mantys were settled in at 29 Harvard Avenue in the township of Brookline, Massachusetts. They rented a home for $40 a month. Peter was a salesman with an annual salary of $2,000 a year. The home was owned by a Lithuanian couple. The man was 48 years old and was a cab driver. He had bought the house for $5,000. According to the census information, 3 families lived in this house at the time: the Mantys, the owner, and another young couple in their late 20s. Both tenants paid $40 a month rent. I am not sure which level the Mantys inhabited, perhaps the 1st or 2nd level, as they had 4 children during their time living there. However, they were not at the house on Harvard Avenue very long. By the end of 1941, Georgia had been born, and they relocated to 85 Surrey Street in Brighton, Massachusetts. This house was larger and more suitable for a family of 7. The girls were growing up before their eyes. Before long, they would grow out of the house on Surrey Street. Both Peter and Aspasia worked very hard and saved funds to buy a home that would accommodate their growing family. In addition to taking care of a growing family, Aspasia was also seeking work as an actress. In 1942, she traveled to New York and met with Mrs. Murray Phillips, the principal of the Murray Phillips Acting Agency, located at 1674 Broadway. Aspasia inquired about the role of Angela, the lead in a new play. Mrs. Phillips sent Aspasia 2 very nice letters praising her for the role of Angela, but ultimately offered her the role of Helen and to understudy for Angela. While Peter worked full-time as a salesman, he was also dedicated to various other pursuits. He worked with the Pan-Elean Federation of America, an organization to aid and assist his fellow countrymen in Greece, and received a certificate of gratitude for his time and financial donations. In 1947, he acquired gainful employment with the esteemed Boston Showcase Company. Their hard work had paid off, and for all their efforts, they were now able to buy a home in Wellesley, Massachusetts. Wellesley was a suburb of Boston and boasted beautiful tree-lined streets, good schools, a family-oriented community, and had main arteries to Boston and beyond. The sense of community and family value would have appealed to both Peter and Aspasia. By 1950, Peter was lending his expertise to the formation of yet another Greek Orthodox church in Newton. This project took roughly 10 years. Peter was on the original board of directors. Between 1984 and 1994, major additions and renovations of the building took place. This is the building today. The times at the Wellesley House were hectic, fast-paced, yet fun-filled days. The girls were growing to high school age, and there was always something exciting going on. Peter and Aspasia were there for all of their special events and occasions. The Mantys entertained regularly, and there were always family and friends around. Aspasia was a fabulous cook and would always prepare Greek dishes for Greek holidays and special occasions. These were happy times, and on any given day you could find them gathered around the piano, often with Aspasia playing and Peter singing. The grandparents put in visits, as did the uncles and aunts. And of course, Aspasia was always in grand form as hostess and mistress of the house. With 5 growing daughters and a mortgage, the Mantys worked hard to meet the demands of their life in Wellesley. As the girls graduated from high school and went off to college, Aspasia took on full-time work as well. She worked in the cosmetics department at Filene's department store in Wellesley from 1954 through 1957. From 1958 through 1962, she worked for a Helena Rubinstein salon on Newbury Street in Boston. She and Peter also found time to hit some of the famous Boston night spots for a night out together. The Latin Quarter was one of their favorite haunts, a very famous club at the time. Incidentally, this club was owned by Lew Walters, who is the father of famed broadcaster Barbara Walters. From 1963 to 1967, Aspasia worked in the cosmetics department at Lord & Taylor in the mall in Natick, Massachusetts. She continued working until Peter fell ill. at which time she remained at home to care for him. Before we bring the presentation to a close, let's take a historical tour of previously inhabited locations. These are the locations where the Mantys have lived over the past 100 years. When Peter Manty fell ill in 1968, Aspasia stopped working to be by his side. She cared for him lovingly and tended to his needs devotedly until his passing in 1971. The Manty family was devastated at the loss of Peter Manty. He was a great man, great husband, father, friend, and patriarch. For more than half a century, since Aspasia was a young girl, they were an institution. She had devoted her life to her husband and children. But with the children grown and living their own lives, Aspasia found herself in the house on Crest Road alone. In her early 60s and a grandmother many times over, she could have settled down, finally put her aspirations to the side, and do as most women her age. But that was not the way of her namesake, and nor was it hers. She had promised Peter that she would go to Greece, visit his homeland, and meet his family. For Aspasia, this would be her first visit to Greece. So that's exactly what she did. In 1972, she boarded a flight to Greece. She had intended to stay for only 6 months and ended up staying for 6 years. She was welcomed and embraced by Peter's relatives in Pyrgos. She met with Alexandra, Peter's sister, for the first time. Alexandra had remained in Greece when the rest of her family had immigrated to America. She also visited her aunts and uncles on her parents' side. They resided in the town of Amphiclea, which is now known as Dadi, at the foot of Mount Parnassus. While in Greece, she took a Greek cruise. She entered a Greek goddess contest on board ship and won first place, naturally. She traveled through Greece, seeing the beautiful scenery, and by her own accounts, had a marvelous time. It was here in Greece that she began to flourish as an actress. She signed with an agency and began doing commercials at first, and then moved on to film. She worked with the McCann Erickson Agency and the Ted Bates Agency, among others. One of the commercials she did both in print and film was for the Chiclets chewing gum product. The Greek ad refers to it as Chick America. Some of the other commercials included Carnation Milk, Wella shampoo, and a Singer sewing machine advertisement. She garnered several acting roles in films, such as Death Has Blue Eyes and A Woman at Her Window in 1976. In 1977, she was picked as a cast member in the famed American film The Greek Tycoon, with Jacqueline Bisset and Anthony Quinn. The film was released in 1978. Unfortunately, and to their loss, Aspasia's part got left on the cutting room floor. As was her nature, she made the most of all situations with her head held high and enjoyed her time in Greece. One of the Boston newspaper's prints, Mrs. Aspasia Manty, formerly of Wellesley, who visited Athens 3 years ago and loves it so much she has failed to return to Boston. Mrs. Manty, well-poised and well-spoken, has appeared in 4 Greek films, on Greek TV, and as a model for Greek couturiers. Although she was discovered quite by accident, Aspasia seems to be slated for bigger and better things in Greek movies, etc., etc. I have chosen to end this story on this high note. It is perhaps as Aspasia would have wanted. Their names are etched in stone on walls and plaques that occupy great places. Their lives are chronicled and archived digitally and on paper for all eternity. Their work with the Greek Orthodox Church have changed the lives of thousands around the world. The annals of Greek and American history bear their names, from Pyrgos, Greece, to Ellis Island and the great eastern seaboard states. Their descendants have prospered and made valuable contributions to society. This was an American story, but it is only fitting that we end this American story here, where it began, in Pyrgos, Greece, where halfway around the world, on the beautiful island of Santorini, more than 100 years ago, a young man gazed upon a Mediterranean sky and made the decision to change the course of his life, and in so doing, altered the course of history for thousands of others. If I may say his given name once more, Pelopidas Montsecourus,